Hello everyone, I am the Scary Midnight Dreams and I am here to help you to sleep today. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where are you from and what time is in your country right now. The Blood Moon Ritual. It was the eve of the Blood Moon, a night that only came once in a lifetime, when the heavens themselves seemed to bleed. The town of Harrow's Hollow, nestled deep within the hills, had long kept its secrets hidden beneath the veil of superstition and isolation. Few ventured near the town, for it was a place where time itself seemed to slow, where the land was thick with the scent of ancient woods, and where the people lived by rites and customs that had been passed down for centuries. They were a people bound by tradition, and on the night of the blood moon, they gathered for the most sacred of rituals. The ritual of the harvest, meant to ensure the town's prosperity and protection for another year. The ritual was ancient, older than the town itself, a practice that had been handed down through generations. Every year, when the blood moon rose high in the sky, the town's elders would gather in the clearing at the heart of the woods, where a circle of stones lay in the shadow of the great oak tree. There, they would perform a sacred ceremony to appease the spirits that watched over the land, to keep the darkness at bay, and to ensure that the harvest would be bountiful and the people safe from harm. The townsfolk spoke little of the ritual to outsiders, and the very mention of it was enough to send a shiver down the spine of anyone unfamiliar with the customs of Harrow's Hollow. But this year, there was something different in the air. Something that felt heavy, as though the night itself was holding its breath. I, Edmund Blackwell, a traveler and a stranger to these lands, had arrived in Harrow's Hollow by mere chance. I had been on a journey, seeking refuge from the troubles of the world, when I stumbled upon the town, weary and lost. The innkeeper, a woman with a sharp gaze and an air of quiet authority, welcomed me into her home with little more than a curt nod. I had no knowledge of the ritual, nor did I know of the blood moon that was to rise that very night. It was only when I wandered into the village square that I saw the strange preparations underway. Figures draped in dark robes, candles flickering with an unnatural glow, and the distant murmur of chants rising from the woods. Curiosity, that most dangerous of impulses, led me to follow the procession. I was drawn to the clearing, where the stones stood like ancient sentinels, their surfaces worn smooth by time and the weight of countless rituals. The people of Harrow's Hollow stood in a circle, their faces illuminated by the light of the blood moon, their eyes wide with reverence and fear. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the sound of the chant seemed to reverberate through the very earth beneath my feet. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to stay. Perhaps it was the lure of the unknown, or perhaps it was the strange pull of the moon itself. As the ritual began, I watched in silence, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was witnessing. The elders stood at the center of the circle, their hands raised to the heavens, their voices rising in a strange, guttural language. The earth beneath them trembled, and the wind howled through the trees, as though the very forces of nature were in turmoil. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine, and yet I could not tear my eyes away. The townsfolk, too, seemed entranced, their faces pale, their hands clasped in prayer. And then, as the ritual reached its climax, something went wrong. I cannot say what it was that caused the disturbance, whether it was the way the moonlight shifted or the way the air seemed to crackle with energy, but I felt it, deep in my bones. A sudden, violent surge of power rippled through the clearing, and the ground beneath our feet split open, as though some great force had awoken from its slumber. The chants faltered, and the faces of the townsfolk twisted in fear, their eyes wide with terror. The elders' hands trembled, their once confident gestures faltering as though they, too, could feel the malevolent presence that had stirred. It was then that I realized the ritual was not meant to bring prosperity. It was meant to keep something locked away, and I, a stranger, had unwittingly broken the seal. The earth cracked open further, and from the depths of the ground, a shape began to rise. It was a shadow, dark and formless, its presence suffocating the very air around us. It whispered in a language older than time, its voice a hiss that seemed to echo in the very marrow of my bones. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The people of Harrow's Hollow began to scream, their voices rising in a frantic crescendo as they tried to flee. But the shadow was everywhere. It was no longer just a shape. It had taken form, twisting and shifting like smoke. Its limbs long and gnarled, its face a grotesque mask of agony. It reached out with clawed hands. The cursed photograph. It was the autumn of 1902 when I, Edward Hawke, a humble photographer with a reputation for capturing the fleeting moments of life, stumbled upon the album that would forever alter the course of my existence. I had spent my days in the bustling streets of London, capturing portraits of the living, the laughing, the joyful. But it was in the quiet solitude of an old, neglected attic that I found a collection of images that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The attic belonged to an old estate on the outskirts of the city, a place I had been hired to photograph for an eccentric collector of antiquities. The house was a crumbling relic of another age, its once grand halls now filled with dust and decay. As I explored the forgotten corners of the mansion, I came upon a small, leather-bound album hidden beneath a pile of old photographs and trinkets. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed, and yet there was an undeniable pull to it, as though it called to me. I opened the album with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The pages were filled with photographs of men, women, and children, faces frozen in time, their expressions a mixture of joy, sorrow, and confusion. The images were not remarkable at first glance, but as I studied them more closely, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Each photograph bore a date, but the dates were not recent. They were decades old, some from the late 1800s, others even older. And yet, the people in the photographs seemed to be staring directly at me, their eyes filled with an eerie intensity, as though they knew something I did not. It was then that I noticed the first oddity. Each photograph was accompanied by a small handwritten note. The notes were simple, stating the name of the person in the image and the date of their disappearance. The names were familiar. Some had been reported missing in the newspapers, others were long forgotten. But as I turned the pages, I realized that the dates of their disappearances were not merely coincidental. Each one had vanished on the very day the photograph had been taken. A creeping dread began to take hold of me, but I could not tear myself away. The photographs seemed to draw me in, their haunting eyes following my every movement. I turned the pages faster now, my heart pounding in my chest, until I came to the final photograph in the album. The image was of a man who appeared to be standing in the very room I now occupied. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. He was dressed in the manner of the late 19th century, his clothes dark and formal, but it was the date written beneath the photograph that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was the date of today. I froze, staring at the photograph, my breath catching in my throat. How could this be? I had not seen this man before, nor had I ever heard of his disappearance. And yet there he was, staring back at me with an expression of sheer terror, as though he knew something I did not. It was then that I noticed something else. The man in the photograph was holding a camera, and in his hands was an image of me. I staggered backward, the album slipping from my grasp, as a wave of dizziness washed over me. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing inward as though the very air had turned suffocating. I tried to shake the image from my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow, its implications too horrific to comprehend. I knew then that I was no longer just a spectator. I had become part of the cursed photographs, the very next in line to vanish. Days passed, and the unease I felt only grew. I began to notice strange occurrences, objects moving of their own accord, whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched even when I was alone. The photographs in the album seemed to grow more vivid, their eyes more intense, their expressions more desperate. It was as though the people in the images were trying to warn me, to reach out from the beyond, but I could not hear their pleas. I sought out every possible explanation, desperate to understand the curse that had gripped me. I visited libraries, consulted scholars, and even spoke to mediums, but no one could offer a solution. The album, it seemed, had been passed down through generations, its origins shrouded in mystery. Some believed it was the work of a vengeful spirit, others whispered of a dark ritual that had bound the photographs to a malevolent force. But no matter how much I learned, the truth remained elusive, and the curse only grew stronger. Then, one night, as I sat in my studio, my hands trembling as I developed a new roll of film, I saw it, the photograph of my own face, staring back at me from the developing tray. I gasped, my heart racing, as the image materialized in the dim light. It was not a portrait I had taken, nor had I ever posed for such a photograph. And yet, there it was, clear as day. The man in the photograph, the one whose fate had been sealed. The Forgotten Asylum. It was in the spring of 1904 that I, Edgar Hale, along with a group of curious souls, ventured into the forsaken halls of the Blackthorn Asylum. The building had stood abandoned for decades, its once proud walls now crumbling and overgrown with ivy, its windows shattered and dark. The asylum had long been a subject of whispered rumors among the people of the nearby town, stories of madness, torment, and the unspeakable horrors that had occurred within its walls. But to us, a group of daring urban explorers, it was nothing more than a forgotten relic, a thrill to be sought, a mystery to be unraveled. We had heard of the asylum's dark past, how it had once been a place of healing, a sanctuary for the mentally ill, but how it had descended into madness after a series of gruesome experiments, and how, eventually, it had been shut down, its patients left to rot in their cells. Yet, none of us truly believed in the ghost stories, the tales of vengeful spirits that still haunted the asylum's decrepit halls. We were young, eager for adventure, and the promise of uncovering the asylum's hidden history was too great to resist. The first steps we took inside the asylum were accompanied by the creak of rotting wood and the rustle of dust. The air was thick with mildew and decay, and the silence was oppressive, as though the very walls were holding their breath. The faint scent of something foul lingered in the corners, and yet we pressed on, our lanterns casting flickering shadows that danced on the peeling walls. We explored room after room, finding remnants of the past, broken furniture, torn medical records, and strange cryptic symbols etched into the walls. But as we ventured deeper into the asylum, a sense of unease began to settle over us. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the silence more suffocating. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. We laughed nervously, dismissing the feeling as nothing more than the natural anxiety that comes with exploring such a place. But deep down, we all knew something was wrong. It was then that we heard the first sound, the faintest whisper, barely audible above the creaking of the building. At first, we thought it was the wind, or perhaps the rustle of rats in the walls. But as the sound grew louder, we realized it was something else, something human. It was a soft, anguished moan, followed by the faintest of whispers, as though someone was calling out to us from the depths of the asylum. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The air grew even colder, and the shadows seemed to shift, moving of their own accord. We tried to shake off the fear, but it clung to us like a second skin. We were not alone. As we continued through the maze of corridors, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the very walls were alive, filled with the voices of the forgotten souls who had once been confined to this wretched place. And then we saw them. Figures, pale and gaunt, moving in the corners of our vision, their eyes hollow and their faces twisted in silent agony. At first we thought they were figments of our imagination, the product of too many stories and too much fear. But as the figures grew clearer, more defined, we realized with a sickening jolt that they were real and alive, in some twisted, unnatural way. The spirits of the asylum's former patients, their souls trapped within the walls, had not forgotten the horrors they had endured. They were angry, vengeful, and they were coming for us. Panic set in as we tried to escape, but the asylum itself seemed to shift, its corridors twisting and changing, as though it had a mind of its own. The walls closed in around us, the doors we had once passed through now locked, the windows barred with rusted iron. We were trapped, and the spirits were closing in. One by one we were picked off by the vengeful souls, their cold hands reaching out from the shadows, dragging us into the darkness. I watched in horror as my companions were pulled into the very walls themselves, their screams echoing in my ears as they disappeared into the void. I ran, my heart racing, my breath ragged, but the asylum was relentless. It knew my every move, anticipated my every step. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the air thick with the stench of death. I could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, calling my name, urging me to join them in the endless torment that awaited those who had dared to enter this cursed place. I stumbled into a room, desperate to find an escape, but what I found there was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The walls were covered in bloodstains, the floor slick with the remnants of some unspeakable ritual. In the center of the room stood a tall, dark figure, its face obscured by a hood, its hands stretched out toward me. It was the source of the curse, the entity that had bound the spirits of the asylum. The haunting of Blackwood Manor. It was in the year of 1889 that Edward and Margaret Blake, a young couple of modest means but great ambition, took residence in the ancient and crumbling edifice known as Blackwood Manor. Situated at the edge of a forlorn village, it had long been a subject of whispered rumors, its reputation steeped in the darkest of tales. Yet, with dreams of grandeur and the hope of turning the manor into a home of elegance, they disregarded the warnings that seemed to plague their every step. The mansion, with its towering ivy-clad walls and windows that appeared to watch like unblinking eyes, stood like a sentinel in the midst of an overgrown forest. Its very presence seemed to breathe with a malevolent life, a life that Edward, with his unyielding optimism, believed could be tamed with time and care. Margaret, though more cautious, was drawn to the house's faded beauty, its secrets veiled behind layers of dust and decay. But as the days passed and the couple began their renovations, a subtle unease settled over them. The walls, once silent, began to whisper, as if the house itself was groaning in protest. It was Edward who first heard it, a faint scratching at the window in the dead of night, followed by the low murmur of voices just beyond the threshold. But when he rose to investigate, there was nothing but the empty, moonlit garden stretching before him, silent and still. Margaret, too, began to sense the change. She would wake in the night, her heart pounding, convinced that something, or someone, was standing at the foot of their bed. At first, she attributed these feelings to the weight of the mansion's oppressive atmosphere. But as the days wore on, the occurrences grew more frequent, more insistent. One evening, as they began to strip away the wallpaper in the drawing room, Edward uncovered a hidden door, half concealed by the remnants of the room's former grandeur. It was old, its wood warped and cracked, as though it had not been opened in decades, perhaps even centuries. The door creaked open with an eerie slowness, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Against Margaret's protests, Edward, driven by an insatiable curiosity, descended into the depths below. What he discovered there was a chamber, a crypt, if one could call it that. Its walls lined with faded portraits of long-dead ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow him, their faces twisted in expressions of silent torment. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface clouded with age. As Edward gazed into it, his reflection seemed to warp and twist, becoming something otherworldly, something wrong. It was then that the house revealed its true nature. That night, as the wind howled through the cracks in the manor's walls, the spirits of Blackwood Manor awoke. They were not the benign specters of folklore, but vengeful apparitions, bound to the house by a curse older than time itself. They fed on fear, growing stronger with each passing night. Edward, once filled with pride and ambition, now found himself a prisoner within the very walls he had hoped to conquer. Margaret, too, felt the grip of the house tighten around her, as if it were drawing her into its very heart. The spirits, relentless in their torment, would not let them go. They whispered in the dark, their voices filled with promises of suffering, their forms shifting in and out of the shadows. At times, the couple would awaken to find their once beautiful home transformed, its walls bleeding, the floors slick with something foul, and the air thick with the scent of decay. As the days turned into weeks, the line between the waking world and nightmare blurred. The couple, once filled with hope and determination, now found themselves consumed by terror. The house had become their prison, and the spirits, their tormentors. There was no escape, no sanctuary. The manor, it seemed, was alive with a hunger that could never be sated. And so, in the end, Edward and Margaret Blake became but another pair of lost souls, their names forgotten by the world, their story swallowed by the darkness of Blackwood Manor. The house, as it had for centuries, stood in silence, its hunger ever growing, waiting for the next to come. The last witness. It was in the winter of 1893 that I, Samuel Thornton, found myself alone in a world of shadows, haunted by memories that would not let me rest. I had been the sole survivor of the massacre at Black Hollow, a place now forsaken by all but the dead and their vengeful whispers. The massacre, a brutal and unholy slaughter, had taken place on a night so dark that the stars themselves seemed to recoil from the horror that unfolded beneath them. The screams of the victims had echoed through the valley, but they were not the only sounds that haunted me. The night had begun like any other, with the promise of warmth by the hearth and the quiet company of friends. But by dawn, every soul within the village of Black Hollow had been extinguished, their lives taken by a force I could not understand. And I, Samuel Thornton, had been spared. But the price of survival was far greater than I had ever anticipated. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my home, my mind a shattered thing, incapable of comprehending the violence that had claimed so many. I had no memory of the massacre itself, only flashes of blood, of screams, of faces contorted in terror. But the worst of it was not the massacre, not the bloodshed. It was the visions, At first, I thought them to be dreams, the fevered imaginings of a mind on the brink of collapse. But they came at all hours, during the day, in the dead of night. Visions of the victims, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. They would appear before me, hovering just beyond the edge of my sight, their mouths moving in silent screams. I would turn, but they were gone, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. I tried to ignore them, to push them from my mind, but they grew bolder. They would appear in the corners of my room, standing like silent sentinels, their faces etched with accusation. They would whisper my name, soft at first, like a breeze passing through the trees. But soon, their voices grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed as though they were all around me, demanding something I could not comprehend. The line between the living and the dead began to blur. I would hear their voices even when they were not there, their whispers filling the air, their eyes burning into my soul. I could no longer tell whether I was awake or lost in some waking nightmare. The spirits of Black Hollow had come for me, and they would not rest until they had what they sought. I sought solace in the company of others, but it was no use. The visions followed me wherever I went. I could not escape them. And as the days passed, I began to question my own sanity. Was I losing my mind? Was I the last witness to a tragedy so terrible that it had driven me to madness? But then, one night, as I sat in the silence of my study, the truth came to me. The spirits had not come to torment me. They had come to demand justice. The memory of that fateful night, the night of the massacre, began to return in fragments, like shards of broken glass. I saw myself standing amidst the bloodied bodies, my hands stained with the life of those I had once called friends. I had been there, in the midst of the slaughter, not as a victim, but as a participant. The truth was more horrific than any nightmare I had ever imagined. I had been the one who had wielded the blade, who had taken the lives of those who had trusted me. The visions, the whispers, the ghosts, they were not figments of my imagination. They were the souls of those I had killed, and they had come to remind me of the atrocity I had committed. I had been trying to forget, to bury the truth deep within my soul, but the spirits would not let me. They demanded justice, and I was the only one who could provide it. I tried to flee, to escape the relentless pull of the past, but there was no escape. The spirits followed me wherever I went, their presence growing stronger with each passing day. They had no mercy, no forgiveness, and neither did I. In the end, I was consumed by the very thing I had sought to avoid, the truth. The line between the living and the dead had disappeared, and I had become one of them. A ghost, trapped in the house of my own making, condemned to relive the horrors of that night for eternity. The mask of forgotten faces, the grand hall of the Valamon estate shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across the marble floors, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and candle wax. The masquerade ball was the event of the season, its invitations whispered about in exclusive circles. It was said that the host, an enigmatic figure known only as Lady Corvina, possessed a collection of masks unlike any other. When Evelyn received her invitation, she was both flattered and intrigued. She was a relative nobody, an artist scraping by in a city where connections meant everything. The gold-embossed card seemed like an opportunity too good to pass up. The invitation came with a single instruction: choose your mask wisely, for it will reveal your true self. Upon arrival, Evelyn was directed to a vast antechamber filled with masks. Each one was a masterpiece, crafted from delicate porcelain, shimmering metals, and adorned with jewels and feathers. She ran her fingers over them, feeling an odd energy radiating from the display. One mask caught her eye. It was simple compared to the others. A smooth white face with hollow eyes and faintly etched lines, as though it bore the weight of countless expressions. Something about it called to her, an inexplicable pull she couldn't resist. When she placed it on her face, a chill coursed through her body. The mask fit perfectly, molding to her features as if it had been made for her. She felt a strange surge of confidence and stepped into the ballroom. The evening was a blur of music, laughter, and swirling colors. Guests danced in elaborate costumes, their masks glittering under the chandeliers. But as the night wore on, Evelyn began to notice something unsettling. The masks seemed to move. Not physically, but the expressions on them shifted subtly, as if reacting to unseen forces. A man with a grinning mask now appeared mournful, his posture slumped. A woman with a serene visage now radiated terror, her hands trembling as she clutched her glass. Evelyn felt the change in herself too. The mask felt heavier, its edges pressing against her skin. Her reflection in a gilded mirror stopped her cold. The hollow eyes of the mask seemed deeper, darker, and within them she glimpsed flickering images, faces she didn't recognize but somehow knew. The music slowed, replaced by a low, haunting hum. Guests began to stumble, their movements jerky and unnatural. Evelyn realized with growing horror that the masks were no longer merely accessories. They were taking over. She clawed at her own mask, but it wouldn't budge. The edges had fused to her skin, and each tug sent a sharp pain through her skull. Panic set in as she felt her identity slipping away, her thoughts clouded by memories that weren't hers. A voice echoed in her mind, cold and ancient. You chose the mask of forgotten faces. Now, you are one of us. Evelyn staggered, clutching her head as visions overwhelmed her. She saw lives she had never lived, deaths she had never endured. The mask was a vessel for the dead, and by wearing it, she had opened herself to them. Desperate, she sought out Lady Corvina, who stood at the center of the ballroom, her own mask an intricate web of black lace and obsidian. Please, Evelyn begged, her voice trembling. Help me remove it. Corvina regarded her with a cold smile. The masks reveal the truth of who we are. You cannot remove it, for it is now a part of you. No! Evelyn screamed, but her voice was no longer her own. It was layered with others, a cacophony of voices speaking in unison. The ballroom dissolved into chaos as other guests succumbed to their masks. Some collapsed, their bodies lifeless as the masks consumed them entirely. Others transformed, their movements no longer human, their laughter twisted into eerie wails. Evelyn fought against the tide of spirits invading her mind, clinging to the fragments of herself that remained. She stumbled toward the exit, the grand doors looming ahead. But as she reached for the handle, a force pulled her back. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was her reflection in the glass, a face she no longer recognized, a mask that had become her prison. The masquerade ended as it always did, with the ballroom silent and empty, save for the masks that lay scattered across the floor, waiting for the next unsuspecting guests to claim them.